Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. And now, here's John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
All right, welcome to the show. We have a great guest on the program tonight. Had a fantastic conversation with Ashley Merryman, who is somebody that, I wrote recently, Brandon, had found that book, Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing. And you and I had talked about this book. And I reached out to Ashley. It's funny. I said to Ashley before the interview that this is one of those things where I saw it on Twitter, and I don't know where I'd been for the last 9 years since this book has been out, but it's a fascinating look at really the science, not just this is why people are competitive. This is why, there are people who tend to win more, people who tend to lose more, and how contagious it can be when somebody makes a mistake in a ball game. And there's science behind all of this stuff, right? Like, it's not just somebody doing that.
No, for sure. And I think what makes Ashley great, one, is she's extremely accomplished, right? I mean, she's been on all kinds of shows. She's, still being leveraged as a wildly successful and well-learned asset for, various industries. But I think what the listeners will hear too, John, is the true clinician and science behind it. This isn't theory without, basis. And it's, to me, and you and I have had several conversations about it. To me, it's a really, really interesting thing to unpack, right? This whole idea of the not just unintended consequences of competition, but how the competitive arena is even built,
right?
How it lays in front of the competitor. She mentions how they had initially thought about the book from the actual competitor side and not from the side of the person putting on the competition.
Yes.
But now through the science of it, we see that has a huge impact as well. So I think the listeners are in for a real treat, and definitely one that may either require some additional like listening to it once or twice if it's really interesting, right? And maybe doing some outside research on, some of the stuff that she brings up, because I know it's something I had to do after listening to it was, oh gosh, I want to go learn a little bit more about that and the impact of that as a competitor.
I think it's so well said. And, it's interesting that speaking of interesting and saying that phrase, as I listened to the show back, because we always do this, if you're ever wanting to do a drinking game aligned with the Mental Advantage podcast, if you choose the phrase, I found this interesting for this particular show, you will be wiped out by the time this interview is over, because I think I led into every single question that I asked Ashley I found this really interesting, Ashley. So, but I love, Brandon, what you just said, because it reminded me, there's a line that's in her actual biography on her website, ashleymerryman.com. That's MERRYMAN. But I love the way this describes her because it's so perfectly written. It says she finds the science essential to understanding what makes people tick, what motivates us, what inspires us, from individual quirks to institutional phenomena. Then she explains how to use these insights to transform our lives. And I was like, man, that's so spot on, because as you listen to this interview, she does present, as you said, that underlying basis for all of our thoughts around this and what makes people tick. But like you said, there's the data that supports it. But then I love where she kind of ends the conversation by challenging people to say, you like, okay, I've just explained some of these things, but now you got to go do. You have to go forth and act, right? And that's something that we challenge people to do all the time. You mentioned some of the great things she's done from a media perspective. I just want to leave the listeners with two books. That, of course, the one that we unpacked during this show is Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing, that she co-authored with Po Bronson. It was an instant New York Times bestseller. But she also wrote a book that was really an influential book as it relates to children. That was probably one of the most influential books ever published. And it was called NurtureShock. That's NURTURE Shock. That she also co-authored with Po Bronson, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 6 months and an Amazon top nonfiction 100 book for over a year. So really cool stuff. I could have talked to her for 3 or 4 hours. We actually talked for a long time after the interview. And I think the listeners will see why. So get your pen and paper ready. You're going to need it. Trust me when I tell you that you're going to need it. And listen here to Ashley Merryman. All right. Well, welcome, Ashley Merryman. I mean, Ashley, we are so excited that you, first of all, agreed to come and talk with us about this great topic of, the premise, or I guess the big part of this discussion is going to be around Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing, because, even though the book came out, was it 2013, I believe, it just, I got a hold of it here recently. I don't know where I've been, but some of our listeners would tell you it's not a surprise at all that it took me so long. But it's a really fascinating book. So thank you for joining us.
Oh yeah, I'm excited to do it, and I don't think the ideas have expired. So
yeah, there you go. Exactly.
They come every day. You go, oh look, that person, performed really well, or that person had a tantrum, and you're like, oh yeah, you can see where that comes from. So
I wasn't going to ask this question, Ashley, but do you find yourself doing that? Like, because this is something you've studied so much and researched so much, that is it hard for you to watch like sporting events or watch different things happen without at least thinking, oh, I wonder.
Well, I'm glad you kept going, because when you said that, I was like, do I find myself having tantrums? I try not to, but I ask my friends on that one. I absolutely dissect and use the science to analyze a performance. I think that that's actually part of the fun now. I'm a big baseball fan, and in baseball, figuring out the strategy, right? Okay, who we're going to do. I'm a Nationals, and I've got a bunch of teams that I love, but the introduction of the designated hitter is just, I hate it, because all of the thoughts I have in terms of the chess, and when you pull people and when you put them out, it's like, ching, and now it's just doesn't matter. So I love that. I think it's another part of the strategy, and seeing how things work, and trying to guess, I don't like psychoanalyzing people who I don't know. I don't really like psychoanalyzing anyone, but so I don't want to be like, a therapist, but I do try and see if there's, insights into the science that I can kind of come up with a different performance, or especially, if someone has an interview and will say something and I know the science relating to that. And I get excited about it.
Well, if nothing else happens, Ashley, in the next hour, your take on the designated hitter just made you my favorite guest we've had on this podcast, because everybody will tell you, look, I am so adamant about this. I'm a National League fan. I grew up, I'm a Cincinnati Reds fan. So I grew up in the National League, the senior circuit, I still call it. And the fact that this is even been discussed at this point just frustrates me, but that's a whole nother show for another day. But,
okay, but we can have it.
You just endeared yourself even more to me. Just put it that way. Yes.
I grew up a Padres fan. I've National League my whole life. So this is just terrible.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm with you 100% on that. Hopefully that this gets all the way to Major League Baseball's front office and they do something about that. So we can't have a discussion about the science of winning and losing without first talking about competition. And I love, it's interesting you mentioned baseball, because that's one of the things I really enjoyed of the many things about this book was how you talked about the Black Sox, you talked about baseball, and there's something I'm going to bring up later on about that importance of practice and not confusing practice with competing, because that made me originally think of batting practice and those players that excelled during that. And then sure enough, like in the next paragraph, you and Po, talked about that. So that was really cool. But I want to first, Ashley, ask you about competition and just kind of start out with just why is it necessary? Like what is it about competition that, is so relevant to everything that we kind of do in our lives?
Well, I guess you're not meaning in a Darwinian sense.
No. That's a 3-hour show.
Again, happy back, and we'll do random. I'm all about random. Well, I think the competition is valuable in a couple different ways. And well, actually, now that's really interesting. See, here I am. I can't even finish.
That's good.
When I first even started writing a book about competition, I was thinking about it from the perspective of the competitor, right? So what is the value of competition from the perspective of the person who's doing it? And then there's quite a few reasons. One, the basic one is to test yourself.
Right.
You don't necessarily know how good you are until you see other people. Right. Especially during the pandemic, if I'm in my apartment, running around or, working out, man, I'm just awesome. But that's because I'm in my apartment alone. It's not until I go to an actual, a gym or, a field and I see other people who are running and working out and going, oh, so I suck. Okay. I didn't know this because I didn't have a reference point. So competition in the very, in a simple way, just helps me know where I am and what I'm doing compared to other people. And then I can say, oh, well, okay, I'm not good at this. Maybe I should either work harder or actually, I'm just really not good at this. Do I have another skill I should pursue instead? Right. So it helps me then figure out, motivation. Where is my motivation? Is it in beating a rival? Is it, just the excitement? Because competition is also fun. Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe I just, maybe I suck, but I just enjoy it. So you have, so there's motivational elements in it. And then there's the actual learning from it, because you also learn, okay, well, that person blew me out of the water. Why?
Right.
You can learn from them. You can learn from your good performance, their bad performance. You learn from from the environment of performance. You just don't get it in isolation. So those, I think, are some of the elements and benefits from the person and from the competitor perspective. But I admit, and your listeners are probably going to go, wow, she's kind of an idiot. But I hadn't really thought of it in terms of the perspective of the competitor or the organizer of the competition.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting because there's a whole line of marketing research in terms of how many prizes do you give away?
Right.
And how many prizes you give away is defined by what's the goal. So if we think about this in terms of, I ran a tutoring program in inner city Los Angeles for a while. So I'm just going to make up numbers just for the point. These are not real numbers. Okay, some donor gives me $1,000 and says, use this to have a writing contest. This is, a little scholarship thing. Oh, okay. Well, how am I going to do that? What am I going to do? What am I going to set up? Well, I could say, I want to use this to catalyze more kids writing essays. So I think I'm going to give 10 prizes away. Or maybe I'll give 100 prizes away, right? They'll be small, but a lot of people will get it. There's some, no, actually what I really want to do is I want to find the best writer in this community and give them a real scholarship. Now I'm going to give 1 or 2 prizes, right? Yeah. So the focus, so you can see that the focus then is it expanding participation? Or is it finding the best person in the sales marketing contests in terms of, like how many people win a prize every time they go into a McDonald's or whatever? Their question is, expanding the marketing base or finding the repeat customers or the potential customers who are going to come in again and again and again. And how you do that is going to then change what you're going to do for prizes. It's going to change the prize structure and the competition structure. And so some of the rules of thumb are that 30% should win a prize.
Okay.
The top 30% performers. And if you look at the Olympics, that's sort of what happens, right? When you have multiple heats and then you move up and it's the top 8 and then ultimately 3 people. So I think, again, that's a different perspective on the value of competition, but we can't forget about both of them. And I think it's interesting then going back to my default, the starting point is I'm the competitor. Now looking at both of those perspectives, that also helps me because now as the person who's the competitor, I'm like, what is the goal of this competition? Why am I here? I know why I'm here. Why do you want me here?
That was something, Ashley, that I thought was so interesting about the book is when you all were talking about the fact that the spread, right? If the first place prize, if you will, is substantially larger than even the second place prize, then all of a sudden that ramps up everybody's level of competitiveness and their effort level and everything goes higher.
You have a shot of winning.
That's right. Only if you have a shot at winning.
If you know you don't have a chance, then you're going to disengage. That's, again, why the goal in terms of, are we identifying our top performers or are we trying to actually get more people involved? But if your goal is to get more people or to find the best and to be the most motivating for those top performers, having the big spread between them is better.
I think you might have just answered my next question because and this was not in any of my notes, but you just made me think about this. Because when you're talking about that, I started thinking about the Olympics and I was like, well, there's no monetary value to those medals. We are the ones who put whatever value we want to them, right? I mean, I guess you could make the argument that somebody, Michael Phelps is monetary value. Yeah, that's right. He's cashed in on, for example. But I do think that it's interesting. I think the one thing about that, when I was reading the book and you start thinking about, okay, well, Olympic medals, for example, the reason that works as such a big thing is, number one, everybody, to your point, has a chance of winning. They all feel like they have a legitimate shot of winning. That's how you're talking about the elite of the elite. And so now that's going to be that motivator and drive for them, right? I mean, even though it's only a few medals up there, that would be that motivator, correct? Or not?
You mean the medals being the motivator?
Yeah. Like, I mean, as far as like, even though it's not a big gap, I mean, there's only 3 medals and it's first, second, and third, right. But it's still, that still acts as a motivator because of the prestige and value that's around it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think even then, what, the layperson's perspective is everyone at the Olympics are the elite, and Olympic coaches will say no. There are the people who are competing because there's one person from their country and getting there was a huge victory, but they didn't expect a medal. And then you have other people saying, no, I'm here for Olympic records. And I'm not only going to win the medal, I'm going to win 12 medals and I'm going to beat the, be the most ever in my sport to receive this. And so we do actually, you even in those, what we would think are all elite perspectives, there's still going to be differences in terms of what people are expecting and going in. But, certainly the Olympic medal isn't just a piece of metal and flowers. There's national pride at stake. There are endorsements and professional careers at stake. And there's just a billion people watching.
Yeah.
We can't forget there are a billion people watching. Well, I don't know what the most recent is now that we have all the crazy streaming. I don't know what the ratings are, but the scale of and the attention on its own makes it a much more important thing. So I would think that, when you add those things, an Olympic medal versus another contest that maybe has $100,000 as the prize money, but less prestige, less publicity, the Olympic medal is going to be more important.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you guys dig into early in the book is the different levels of competition, or I should say level of competitor. Like, for example, you spend some time breaking down adaptive versus maladaptive competitiveness. You talk about, the fact that it depends on this, like male, female, gender, gets into that. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, about what makes somebody maybe more naturally competitive than others.
Ooh. Well, there's a lot of different factors. I think that, but we also sort of need to slow that down a little bit as a phrase, naturally competitive. Because I think when we talk about, especially in American parlance, they're competitive. Mm. If you're talking about your friend over poker night, this is not a compliment, right? If you're talking about Michael Phelps or, some Olympians come, now competitive is wonderful, right? So I think there's a context thing, and there's different types of baggage that come in and out of competitiveness. So when we're talking about competition in terms of just your average day-to-day personality, that was what you were talking about in terms of that maladaptive. Yeah. I think, we go, that person's competitive. We don't mean that as a compliment. We're not talking about competitive fire and perseverance. We're talking about someone who treats every competition as a blood sport, whether it's I'm getting a promotion, I'm getting an Olympic medal, or I'm getting a parking space at the mall. It's all, and no one wants to be around that person. It's a miserable experience. And an adaptive competitor is someone who picks and chooses their battles and says, there might be another parking space at the mall. Let me go around. And if there isn't, I'm going to at least not freak out over it. I'm not going to kill someone. So the adaptive competitor is the person who's picking and choosing what they compete in that's more important. Now, they may be in those times incredibly engaged, but they're not, treating everything with that same sort of level of ferocity almost, I think is probably the better way to go with that. And then, so I think that is definitely a factor. Now, is that innate or taught? The answer is usually always yes and. Right. There's cultural elements, there's environmental elements. What we consider to be appropriate in one environment is not necessarily the same as someone else's. And the gender stuff, I love talking about the gender stuff. The story is that women are less competitive than men. But the research is pretty clear that the main reason that is because women only compete when we know we're going to win. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when we do compete, the stakes are usually so high that we really have to make sure that we're going to win. And that changes levels of preparation and all kinds of things. So those are a few top notes in terms of why a lot of different things go into it. I don't think it's just that, and certainly one of the things when we started, when we decided to name the book Top Dog, which had a big discussion over it, okay, the point of this is not some people are born great competitors and then the rest of us are just also ran. Yeah. The point of the book and really more importantly, the point of the science is that everyone can do well in competition if they understand the factors that are affecting their performance. And that was what we really hoped. I mean, there were some people who were still going to hate it, and they're not going to think it's fun, and they're just going to be stressed out. But we can help them do better when we know the science. And then people who love it, then they're even going to do even more, or they're going to at least understand when they're doing well and when they're struggling.
Yeah,
that's the question, but
you did, and it's interesting because I loved. I think it's one of the struggles that a lot of coaches that we deal with, Brandon and I, are always on the show talking about. How do you teach competitiveness? Like, is it something that can be taught? Because one of the pain points, if you ask a lot of sports coaches, is I just need to find people who are more competitive. I just don't think that this individual is as competitive now. I'm talking at that high school level, right? Like by the time they reach college and the pros, some people, still kind of have that. They maybe aren't as competitive as some of their teammates, but I mean, it is something that coaches are struggling with. How do you get them to be more competitive? Is that something that you think can be taught? Is it something that you can, if somebody's innately not as competitive a person, or maybe it's that, can you make the switch, I guess, from an adaptive competitor to a maladaptive? Not that you would want to, but at least.
No, you don't want that.
Yeah.
You would want to switch a maladaptive to an adaptive.
Yeah. Keep the fire going when you're competing, right? But not necessarily when you're not competing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just to dive into the maladaptive for a second, maybe that'll make more sense. That'll help make the rest of my answer make a little more sense. So one of the reasons that I am so troubled with the maladaptive competitor is that one of the elements that the research seems to suggest is that it's not just that I have to compete for everything, it's that I have to win. Mm-hmm. And the anger and the anger at not winning, the anger of, not doing well that the maladaptive performer has then relates to how they're playing. And if you look at the maladaptive competitor, there's often this undercurrent, but I'm going to win.
Right.
I should win. In fact, if you really think about it, I've already won. This is just a formality.
Right. Yeah.
If you wanted to, you could just give me the trophy and you can all go home because I'm going to win this. And if that is your mentality, I'm the person who's supposed to win this. How I win it is less important. Mm-hmm. And if I am it's a fait accompli, I am innately supposed to win this. It doesn't matter how I win. And that can include cheating.
Right.
That can include rule breaking. It certainly can include not just trash talking, but trying to destroy psychologically my opponent. Yeah. Right. It's really because it doesn't matter because I win.
Yeah.
Right. So the maladaptive competitor, it's not just that they're, yes, they're being difficult and we don't want to deal with them because it's just a pain in the butt, but it's more realizing that they don't respect the competition and they don't respect the competitors. Yep. And the value of competition, remember I talked about, is learning and improving from your competitors. If you don't respect the competition and you don't respect the competition, you're not going to learn from it. You're not going to improve over time.
Yeah.
Right. So the maladaptive competitor is, more likely to cheat, more likely to take advantage and miss a lot of growth opportunities. So that's why I want someone to be the adaptive competitor, because I want the great competitor, well, there certainly have been great elite maladaptive competitors. I'm not going to name any names, but I mean, we know that, everyone can have someone come to their mind and okay, fine. But to when you're talking about coaches and development, I want someone to be an adaptive competitor because I want them to be motivated to improve, even more than how the motivated for result. And I know I talk to a lot of coaches about that. I say, the benefit of competition is not winning. The benefit of competition over time is improvement. I cannot guarantee that your players will win every time. We named the book Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing.
Right.
Our editors and publishers were like, couldn't we just do the science of winning? We're like, yeah, we wish we could, but no, we cannot. But the ability to embrace that losing experience for learning, for taking apart your performance, taking apart others, it's much harder if you started thinking you were entitled to win. A loss that you didn't expect may be psychologically devastating, right? If you have a fixed mindset that I am the winner and everyone else is terrible, to find out you're terrible, I don't know, you may not be able to come back from that in some perspectives. So I'm leery of this idea that coaches are always looking for more competitive.
Right.
I want to know what that
competitive.
means.
Yes.
Well, no, I just want to know what that means.
Yeah.
Does it mean I'm showing up for practice more? Does it mean that I am a good citizen on my team and that I support other people on the team? Does being competitive mean I hate the other teams, but I love my guys and I'll do everything? Does it mean I'm putting everything out during the competition? I just want to know what that means before I'm saying, can this be taught or should you try and look for this? I want to know what the real goal is. And just like I was saying, I think we have a lot of different conversations and, sort of casual understanding of what does competition mean. I think competitiveness means different things for other people. If it's more, I think just sort of a general, I want this badly. Well, again, even then, I'm kind of leery about saying that should obviously be the thing because, I've done a little bit of science research looking at the science of perfectionism. And perfectionism isn't just, I have to be perfect. Perfectionism is why? Why do you have to be perfect? Do you need to be perfect for yourself? You have high standards, perfection striving. That if there is a productive version of perfectionism, that's where it's at. If you're supposed to be perfect for others, a parent, a coach, the fans, that is a destructive thing. You will fail.
Yeah.
Right. You're not going to be perfect and you're never going to be able to live up to their expectations. That is an unsustainable thing. You may be able to do it for a year. You may be able to do it for 10 years, but at a certain point, people who are other directed are much more likely to have burnout and depression and other things going on in the way. So again, the idea if it's like, okay, someone's a really good player, but he doesn't seem competitive enough.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to sit down and talk to that person. Is it, they don't like it? Or that maybe they don't even want to be in the sport, but their family or some other social pressure has made them do it. Or maybe it's the opposite.
Right.
Maybe they're underperforming because the pressure of the coach or the team or whatever is so high, they're kind of disengaging because they can't do it.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that, it's one of those, to me, a broad thing like that is something you just have to start asking more questions rather than just ruling someone out.
It's funny you say that because Brandon and I have talked about this a few times on the show where we say it's so important for coaches to define what that is. If you're asking your players to be more competitive, for example, and we've used that exact analogy of just make sure you're defining it, that everybody is aligned on the terminology there and the goal because it's hard. Ashley,
I'd rather not do it.
Yeah.
Because, the research in terms of mindset, and I'm thinking of, lessons that Carol Dweck from Stanford.
Yes, you were getting ready to, you're going down the path I was headed.
I was. But one of the things that she, taught me, especially when you're talking about little kids, but this applies to everybody, is that, if you're talking to a little kid, right, the difference between saying, oh, you worked really hard on that, or, oh, you're so smart, or you're so talented, oh, you're so competitive. That's who I am.
Right.
And if you are, as a coach, telling me this is your perspective of who I am, I don't need to change it.
That's right.
Especially if it's negative. Yeah. Right. And so what you want to do is you want to be focusing more on skill acquisition and feedback that relates to skills.
Yeah.
Or something you did, you worked really hard on that, or you stayed late for practice, or you improved your swing, or you you're working on your stamina, whatever the appropriate thing is. But if we're focusing on what people do, then they can change it up or down. If we focus on who they are, there's less evidence to change because they don't think that is their image of themselves. And now you've said that this is your image of them. And how hard is it for me to change how you think of me as a human person versus I don't like it when you do blank. Oh, okay. I won't do that anymore.
Right.
Right. So I think that it's less about focusing on what's the right definition of competition or competitiveness. That's good for you to help coaches, but we should just stop talking about this for players and start talking about more specific skills they can acquire.
That's a very good point that hopefully a lot of the coaches that listen to the show pick up on, because it's interesting you mentioned Dweck, because I was thinking as you were discussing the difference between adaptive and maladaptive, that by what I know about fixed mindset, my instinct is to think that maladaptive people are more of that fixed mindset. But then there's part of me that thinks if I'm really that obsessed with the winning piece, is there any opportunity or window for growth mindset to come into there? Because if I'm constantly obsessed about winning, then I'm of course wanting to get better and better at whatever it is I'm doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I generally think that people who are having more of a fixed mindset, believing that this is how I am, are probably more in that maladaptive. I don't actually have any data sets that I could say we've actually identified this for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I could make an argument about adaptive the same way, right? I mean, I'm pretty competitive and I have really high standards, but there are certain things I will not compete on.
Right.
Because it's just not a good use of my time.
Yeah.
So it's not so, but I could still think I could still have a fixed mindset and say, I am the best in the world at blank, but I don't care about these other competitions. I don't care about the friendly board game. I don't care about the parking space at the mall. This one particular thing, I must be the best. I am the best. There is no, right. So I think that I kind of think that you could have both in both camps. I sort of lean to you're probably more likely to see people in a fixed mindset than in a maladaptive perspective, but I don't think it's exclusive. You certainly could have people with a fixed mindset in the adaptive. I think it would, yeah.
Is there, without getting too specific about this, but did you all find in your research that there are certain professions, for example, that more maladaptive type personalities or competitors tend to lean towards?
I haven't seen anyone actually do that as a study.
Okay.
I think that, people definitely have anecdotal experiences with it. Mm-hmm. But I haven't actually seen anyone actually do data on that. So I don't know the answer. And I don't want to be,
right. Yeah. So you brought up talking about the fact that competition earlier, we were talking about brings out the best in people. And one of the articles that I liked or the worst, depending on who it is, but we'll focus on the best in this particular example, because I love the story that you all share in the book about the 2008 Olympics 4x100 race with Jason Lezak, because I think so many of us who watched that could see that it was just such a powerful moment where somebody set a personal best in that particular leg of the race, that they not even was it a personal best, but not had ever even come close to that type of a thing. So that beauty of what competition can do, where it really raises us. But then the other aspect of this, Ashley, that I'd like you to talk about is the role of team in that, like how important that also played a role into that particular instance.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, having a team, I think I touched on this a little bit in terms of at the beginning, in terms of the value of competition.
Absolutely.
And what makes someone competitive or not. But, having a team dynamic absolutely changes how you think. It changes your physiology. A couple of my favorite little studies just to show you just how powerful the thoughts are. I think, everybody's, watched a baseball game on television or went to it, and the ref says out, and everybody in the stands starts screaming, "What do you say? Are you blind?" Right? I mean, that always happens. And you're just so, you can't possibly think that anyone got this. Well, neuroscientists and researchers actually looked at sort of a phenomenon like this. And what they found is there's part of the brain, that these mirror neurons. And the part of your brain, when you're watching someone do pretty much anything, you process it by actually thinking what it would be like to do it yourself.
Mm.
And so, if I'm scratching my nose right now, and all of your listeners are thinking, "Oh, I'm scratching my nose," because then I understand what it's like, right. And I can't see you're doing it because this is audio. But so you imagine this, and that has that connectedness. And the closer we are to the person who's doing it, the stronger the relationship, obviously. So the researchers found that basically a team, when you're watching the team you love and they slide into home plate and they're told they're out, your brain processed it as if you slid into home plate, and you obviously would have made it.
Wow.
And because you would have made it, you can't possibly believe that your teammate didn't, because that's you on the field, right? You're connected. And that's why it's actually so hard to believe the ref and to know, no, our guy was safe, because you actually thought you slid under base.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it really, and watching your sports team win, watching your political candidate win changes your testosterone for days. Watching your team lose, watching your candidate lose, reduces testosterone for days. So, and that's, again, the team concept is pretty attenuated. It's only in my head. Yeah. Once you actually start putting jerseys on people and having them actually practice, now you can see that there's this real connection. And obviously that's going to be highly motivating.
Yeah, it's sometimes interesting.
Fault, right?
Right.
It's one of those little things that most people don't even pay attention to, but Po and I were just like, "Oh, we love that." Let me ask you, pop quiz.
Yes, pop quiz.
Pop quiz. Everybody wants a great team player, right? Everyone says they want a great team player. If you read want ads, I don't know what an internet version of a want ad is, but Indeed.com.
Right.
We want a team player, right? What's a team player?
Somebody who works well with others, right? Somebody who can align to the goals of the team and work well with others.
Yeah, is that actually a good thing? What if your team's underperforming?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you maybe want somebody who's going to pull the rest of the team forward. Yeah.
I love job descriptions that say want a team player and a self-starter.
Yes.
No, one or
right.
the
right. That's right.
By definition, you can't be both, right? The whole point of a team, right? So, and if we really take apart teams, there's only a tiny bit of research, but there's a little bit of research looking at the role of a team captain. And a team captain has like 5 different duties, and hardly any actual team captain does more than 1 or 2 of them. Some of them do nothing. That's the actual role of leader on a team. But so once you start thinking about it, who's motivating, who's teaching, who's saying, yeah, I know this is all really terrible. I'm going to go tell coach that he sucks, or I'm going to plan the party afterwards, or right. So who is the team player? Who's the person who motivates? Who's the person who scolds the team for underperforming? Yeah, I guess it's the coach and the manager, but there's often people in the team saying, "Come on, we got to step it up."
Yeah.
Right. And that's a specific type of person. The reactant is the one person who, when everybody else is going with the flow, goes, if everyone else is in a good mood, they're in a bad mood. Yeah. If everyone else is in a bad mood, he's like, "Okay, come on, you guys, now it's time to pull it together." And you don't want a team of reactants, because then that would just be
right.
But you want at least 1 or 2 reactants on your team.
Yeah.
it can be that the best team player is the person who's the worst team player.
Interesting.
You need someone there who's willing to take a risk, fire people up, scold people, disagree when everyone's sort of agreeing on a strategy. And it's just, this person doesn't have to win. They're not always right. But to have someone say, are you sure? Have we really thought about this game plan? Do we know? When everyone else is going, oh yeah, that sounds good. Okay, let's just do that. No, wait, let's think for a second. So I'm not convinced that we all really want team players. I don't think we want people to be cruel and terrible to each other.
Right.
But again, team player is another one of those meaningless phrases we turn around and are actually seem to be devoted to, and we don't know what it means, and we haven't really thought about it. Because again, I used to collect them. The number of ads that wanted a self-starter team player, I just giggled every time.
That's hilarious. No, it is so true. And you even caught me thinking about it in the same way. I want to shift gears a little bit here because we started to touch on this about when we were talking about gender and the effect of the impact, I guess, on that competition. The other thing I found very interesting that was, I guess, not necessarily going down that road, but it was about siblings because I'm the second youngest of 7 in a large family. And we would all self-describe as, competitive, right? I'm learning now as I'm reading this book that's different levels and maybe some of the ways that we would describe ourselves probably would have been more maladaptive in the sense that like we had to win all the time and anything we were doing, including getting food off the table when there's 7 kids, talking. That was
what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I would tell you, Ashley, that, my wife gets so frustrated when she goes over to any family gathering because everybody's so loud. And I said, it's just because when I was growing up, if you wanted to be heard, you just spoke louder than anybody else in the room. And so that's how that worked. But I am curious. I find it, I was really intrigued with that. And if you could unpack this a little bit for the listeners, the role of birth order and how that can have on one's competitiveness in just the early years in general. And then also, I found it interesting that there are rarely any more hard fought battles than when 2 siblings are competing against each other. It just seems like that brings something out.
Well, it is interesting. I was about to say I'm a history nerd, but I'm just a nerd. I'm just all and any random thing, I'm always like, "Ooh, that's cool." And when you were saying that about hard-fought battles, I was thinking about sort of the more in U.S. history, the families that ended up on the opposite sides of the Civil War or the Revolutionary War are so painful to me that you're like, "Wow, that is just like the core of everything." And so that would obviously be the most extreme, but not what you were talking about. But that was where,
yes,
the strongest battles, those to me humanize that in a different way. Because,
absolutely.
But so more of what I think you were talking about, in terms of like Frank Selloway's research out of Berkeley and some of his colleagues, that, your older sibling, or in my case, in some ways, I'm an only. And everyone goes, "Oh, it has something." I hate that. But the older one is sort of always got the lead. He obviously by default, he or she is going to be older, smarter, more talented, more experienced, knows everything because he literally or she literally has lived longer than their competition. Mm-hmm. Right. So they sort of have this expectation of winning. They have this expectation of being the leader and the person who should be in charge. And the youngest ones, they also know this information. They understand that they're significantly younger, significantly less experienced. So the research seems to suggest that they realize the only way that they're going to be successful is to take a risk and do something crazy. Playing by the rules, traditional expectation and strategy, older sibling wins every time. So doing something that nobody else expects and just going for it And maybe if they're little or they're smaller and wilier, they can just sneak right in between everybody else. That seems to, be the way that the little kid succeeds. And there's actually some research that persists even in professional sports. Yeah. So the older siblings tend to be pitchers, and the younger siblings who end up being in pro sports end up being more known for batting, more stealing bases, and just, taking some crazy risks, because that's what they
interesting.
How to succeed. Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I thought was fascinating about that particular topic in the book was when you're talking about, and hopefully I get this right. I always hate when I'm talking to authors of the book and I say something like, yeah, that was not anywhere close to what we were doing. And trust me, it's happened on the show, so it won't be the first time.
That's my fault as the writer for not explaining.
Yeah. But you were talking about that early development and how kind of naturally we're all familiar with when children are little that they withdraw from competition if they're not winning or they're not doing very well. They tend to quit a little bit easier, and that there was something to be said for those younger siblings because they have to fight and maybe push a little bit more, like you were saying, taking risks, but also be a little bit more relentless, because the only way that they're going to win or at least compete in a positive way would be to work a little harder. And that naturally that has a long lasting effect for them because they learn to just go a little more and the extra mile, if I understood that correctly. Because I have this long theory that I've had for years that as a coach, because I've been in coaching for a long time, that younger siblings tend to be, I wouldn't say necessarily better athletes, but there's something about that idea of being in the birth order as far as the way that they compete on the court, field, whatever. So,
well, just to push back a little bit, to go back to what you were saying before, you said in a couple times naturally.
Yes, I know. I'm guarding myself about that now. Every time I say that,
want we can stop saying naturally.
Yes,
because that goes back to sort of the, I guess the nature or nurture, and the presumption is naturally. Well, no, not necessarily. It's not necessarily a biological thing. It's not like, the youngest baby is the runt of the litter and they're naturally smaller. They're just temporarily smaller. Right.
Right.
So there was a socialization process that I don't think we can forget. Yeah. And that may persist and it may change and impact their development, but I don't think we can inherently say that they're naturally different in that way. But I mean, there is some research that shows that younger siblings who are more competitive may have a more risk-taking or maybe, depending on the context, more creative approach. But creativity, I think, has some risk in it because it may not work. So I think that's, again, you can sort of see that would be smart. You have to figure out a new way to approach this, and then learning that strategy is something that might persist over time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also, we kind of were talking a little bit about this when you were saying the effect of, when people are sliding in to the base and the umpire and the mirroring and stuff, it made me start to think about just the idea that you all talked about in the book as far as home field advantage and just like, because I started thinking about crowds, right? And I know that this is a little bit of a shift, but just with regards to that effect of home field advantage, I thought that was a really interesting thing. And we won't really have time to unpack that because I want to get into one more thing, but I bring that up. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I bring one more thing back to siblings?
Yes.
So in my first book, NurtureShock, we had a whole chapter on siblings, and siblings in child development, not just in competition, but just everything. And one of my favorite studies was actually titled, They're as different as night and day. And they actually did research to find out if siblings really were as different as night and day. And by and large, they were not. When parents and the kids themselves would say, oh yeah, we're so not different. And then you would give them like skill tests and different things and attitude tests. And the differences were the within family differences were so small compared to everybody else. If you split the siblings from two households, you go like, oh, those two kids, the peas in a pod, it's the same. And I think this goes to that sort of rival and who's your competitor and do you have a chance of winning? If the younger sibling thinks there's a chance of winning by taking a risk and being creative, then they're going to do that. But if they go, no, there's no way I can beat my older sibling, then I'm as different as night and day. I'm not athletic. I'm an artist. I'm an arty. I play music. I don't do the business and the math thing. I'm going to do the literature thing. And then actually over time, you do become as different as night and day in many ways, but it's because you've made this choice not to compete. Because you've realized that I don't want to compete with my sibling because either I'm going to lose or psychologically it will be damaging for that person or for me. Or, there are lots of different reasons why you might go that other direction. But, so again, in terms of the value of the competition, am I going to win? Am I going to grow? Am I going to improve? There are lots of situations where either the sibling or the parents for the sibling have said, no, they're so different and push them in opposite directions to give them their space. And, but most of the time that innate difference thing is actually way overrated in the empirical data. Yeah.
So all of my 6 brothers and sisters will be so disappointed to hear you say that because of the fact that for so long, I think they hung to this idea that my mom would always impart to us that we were so different, even though there were 7 of us, because I think they liked the idea that maybe they were different from the next person in the group.
There is value in that. There is this, I wanted to find myself as my own person.
Yes, especially in that group.
Yeah, especially, the big family and they're, like, which one are you? And it was like, right. Like, no, I'm me because I'm doing this thing nobody else is doing. But again, that's a choice that the family, that the child, that the parents have been actually pushing into the development rather than just everybody just came out so differently. It's just amazing. Well, yeah, there is some personality and genetics and stuff like that, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with, again, that desire to be, your own person, which is really human. Yeah.
We and you've been so gracious with your time. We've spent a lot of time talking about the competition part of things, but I did want to, I'd be remiss if I didn't start to unpack a little bit in the last, 10 to 15 minutes here about the winning and losing part of this, because I know being the science of winning and losing. And one of the things that really fascinated me, and I shared this with you in a couple of the emails I sent, was this research on COMT. And if I even tried to say that word, COMT. Okay. I'll just say COMT. But it was really, I'd love for you to discuss how COMT can sometimes be a predictor of a winner prior to even the competition. Some of that research or those biomarkers anyhow.
Yeah. So the COMT gene is, there's an enzyme in the brain that's regulated by genetics. So that's the COMT gene, COMT. And the COMT gene enzyme is involved in this is a bastardization of the science. So I apologize if anybody out there is geneticist going, oh my God, I do know better. I'm just trying to make it clear.
She's trying to dumb it down for me is what she's saying.
No, I'm dumbing it down for me. I always say, one of my most favorite things that I always say is I'm idiot proofing it and I'm the idiot. So this is how I remind myself to think about it, which is that the enzyme, the COMT enzyme is really sort of helping metabolize dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is one of the responses, the chemical responses, especially to victory. There's more stuff going on. The more we learn, the more complex everything is. But that, dopamine is a chemical that's about engagement and response. Earlier, people thought it was, just a chemical for winning. And I actually like to think of it, that, if you've won things, have you ever won things and afterwards felt let down?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Or not as satisfied.
Yeah. And you're like, why is this? And you were so excited on the way into the competition.
Yeah.
And then you won and you're like, well, that kind of stinks. And you're like, well, why? No, I should be joyous. I won. I've been working at this. The dopamine that you were getting from the motivation of the working and the team and the environment and the anticipation far outpaced the dopamine you got when you actually got handed the medal. So I actually think of dopamine. Yes, you get it for rewards, but I think actually dopamine for me, is the chemical manifestation of motivation.
Wow.
So yeah, which is pretty amazing, right?
Yeah.
Which again, when you start thinking about what's the value of competition, it's improvement, it's engagement, it's motivation. All of this is about biochemistry in the brain, right? So going back to the comp gene, there's a couple different variations of it. There's a val-met, met-met, and val-val. And each one of those, of the different combinations, is how fast you metabolize dopamine. And so someone who's val-val actually metabolizes it super fast compared to the met-met. And then your val-met, as you can guess, split the difference. Mm-hmm. But the val-val actually may metabolize it too quickly. If dopamine is motivation, and if you have it too quickly, you can see where this is going, right? Which is, I'm not motivated. So I need to look for risks. I need to look for social environments or just doing things to give myself this new jolt, because my jolts don't last long and I need to keep going. So people who are val-vals tend to be more extroverted. They tend to be more risk takers. There's a whole bunch of different things about it. And then your met-met, they're metabolizing dopamine at a more slow rate, which means they're already close to ceiling. And too much excitement, too much rewards, too much stress, too much motivation, right? This is so important to me, can actually overwhelm the brain because there's too much dopamine. It's kind of like flooding the gas tank or, flooding the car. And it's just, so you're too close to ceiling and you've hit ceiling. So, other researchers have sort of coined the term that the val-val are, people describe them as the warriors, and the met-mets are warriors, because the met-mets on an average day are engaged and focused and they can master every detail. But when it comes to a big test or a big competition, these are the people who just suddenly melt. You're like, what happened to you? You were great. And all of a sudden, the night before the thing, you're just gone. And then there's these other people who've not been that engaged, kind of flaky, and they do the best of their lives under this stress. And you're like, where did this person come from? And that may, I don't like to, as I said, I don't like to psychoanalyze people, don't like to genotype people. But you can see that there actually may be a neuroscience explanation to it, that they need that, higher level of stress or engagement to kick their brain up into a normal level. And even if someone doesn't want to do the genotype, and I'm not suggesting people start looking for their val-val.
No 23andMe involved here or anything.
Yeah, don't
like
do that. Yeah. There's, every once in a while there's, military studies, who's working on the battlefield, and then people start freaking out about recruiting based on genotypes. And you're like, no.
Can they change that, Ashley? Like, I'm thinking about this because there's so many times as a coach, I would have players that great during practices, right? Games even. It wasn't even the big game. It was just the game itself became different because they were, now I know, probably more of that met, right?
Well, again, we don't want to change.
That's true. I know you just told me not to do that. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I think it's important, because again, the book is not about people are good competitors or bad competitors.
Yeah.
It's understanding where your starting point is. So if you are someone you think, oh wow, I am a warrior. I don't know what my genes are, but I know that I'm one of those people who freaks out. then, or if you're as a coach and you see that someone, great at practice, freaking out in the competitions, then you need to develop a strategy to help them practice competition, which is different than practicing the skills.
Yep,
practicing
absolutely.
in the competitive environment so that they get more used to that is, and there is research that shows that you can't, magically rewrite someone's genetic code, but you can help a met become more familiar in a competitive environment and come up with better coping strategies for the stress, either recognizing when they're going to get stressed, practicing, how are they going to respond to things? Coping mechanisms work. So yes, it's very important if you have a coach or if you have a player as a coach who's having these trouble, to help them figure out specific things. And the worst thing to do would just be to pretend this is not an issue.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they'll work it out. No, not necessarily. You need to help them with this. And, and I think it's really important that, people think about mastering competition as its own skill, right? You can have all the technical things down for, a particular type of task, but it's different in competition because the stakes are different. Because now, again, we're talking about that social pressure. We're talking about the reference points with your team, with your players, and the other people going around. And it's qualitatively different. One of my favorite silly little studies, but it just rings so true to me. They had college students playing a video game. And unsurprisingly, they're doing very well. They're college students playing a video game. And I don't think it was supposed to be that complicated either. I think they were set up to win. And at some point, some confederate of the professor would walk in and go, wow, that's a really high score. And immediately they would crash and burn. And it's because they stopped paying attention to the game and they started paying attention to the fact that someone was watching them play the game. And that split in cognitive focus meant they weren't going to do as well. And then when they screw up, then they go, wow, that person saw me screw up, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So I think that we need to practice competition in competitive environments along with practicing the actual skill. And I don't think that's something that coaches do well enough. I'm sure there are good coaches out there who are doing that. But I think that it needs to be a more conscious element of it.
Yeah, you give some good examples in the book of Anson Dorrance from UNC Soccer doing just that, really making sure from a practicing standpoint, bringing that competition into that. That's a great way to kind of wrap things up. And I apologize. Any guest of the show will tell you that sometimes we just go in different directions and, and then we try to bring it back in.
I'm always that way.
So you were natural. I'm going to get rid of the word natural. I'm going to quit saying it now. I might have said it again. But now it's going to be this thing. It'll be like, it'll be like, I'll feel like there's a buzzer or something that should come out and smack my hand. But we do tend to say that. I think a lot is we just blame everything on that nature. Like, okay, this is just the way it is. But I really do appreciate you, Ashley. In this book, guys, for the listeners, Top Dog, The Science of Winning and Losing. And she even brought up another book, and we will talk about this in the introduction, but NurtureShock. Both of these books by her and her co-author, Po Bronson. Fascinating stuff. And definitely so glad that you were able to come on the show and unpack some of these things. And I can't wait to read NurtureShock. I have not dug into that one yet, and it's not going to be too late for me, even though my kids are all older. They probably will wish that I had read that earlier in my life, but they're doing okay. So they can't complain too much.
They're great. And one of the things about NurtureShock, which was fun, is people always ask, why did you write a book? I was like, well, because it was interesting to me and because it was relevant to my life. Right.
Yeah.
And so, NurtureShock, different chapters have different topics. And it's because those were interesting to me.
Yeah.
I mentioned about siblings. I'm an only. So sibling relationships are just mysterious. And I want to know what the heck's going on there. And, and Top Dog is about competition because in the air and I want to understand it. So even if you have grown up kids, you can still relate to NurtureShock. But it's fun because it's competition.
It's fun. It's competition. There's so many great anecdotes in there. There's so many great studies. We didn't even get into the competition machine and stories about the Black Sox and getting into some of the things about why there's not more females that are running for office, like the higher, Congress. So all of it's just really good. You guys can go out and find a book, huh?
Fred Smith, FedEx.
Yes, exactly. I love that story. Yeah. I mean, there's so many of those that I was like, just wanted to unpack, and we'll definitely, would love to have you come back at some point. We'll talk a little bit more about, how we can do more of these applications, because I loved what you were saying there at the end. And I think what people need to understand, and that's what this podcast is all about, is just because this is where you are, we're all about that growth mindset. There are things that we can do to affect change in our own lives. We can change the way things are. It may take just, coming up with some, tactics and strategies to be able to do it, but everything is worth, you have the ability to change it, put it that way.
Can I throw out one more study and then dive?
Absolutely. No, you can.
But it's totally relevant to what you were saying.
Yeah.
Which is, and again, what you were saying, are like, yes, everyone's going, yes, of course, that's what you should do. You should grow and you should have new strategies and you should do all this. But the reality is we just don't.
Right.
And so this is the one study, and then I'm going to stop torturing you. They had British infantry and they asked them to do a 1-day jump school. So they went from never having parachuted before to, at the end of the day, jumping out an airplane. And they were required, one of the things and this was in the military, they always talk about being voluntold. And voluntold is when you're ordered to volunteer to do something, but these were real volunteers because they're going to be jumping out of airplanes. But one of the other requirements is they all had to be in the British equivalent of high school athletes. And so after they did the jump, they said, okay, did what were you thinking? What was your coping mechanism for getting the fact that you were going to throw yourself out of a perfectly good airplane? And most of my favorite of the most common strategies for coping was, this is going to be so much better when it's done.
Yeah, that's right.
That was the coping mechanism, is I'm just going to look forward to when this is over. There was no coping mechanism. And the researchers found that this was a real problem because people started doing that even in the safety briefings.
Yeah.
Right. So they're not listening to the actual thing that will help them.
They all just wanted to be over.
Because they just wanted to be over. Exactly. And they said, okay, well, did you have coping mechanisms when you were, an athlete in secondary school? And they were, oh yeah, absolutely. Did you use any of them when you were on your, no, it didn't occur to me. And so, but the research is pretty clear that coping mechanisms work. We talked about that before. And the elite performers develop more coping mechanisms over time and realize that different circumstances, different points in their career, different environments require different types of coping mechanisms, but that they tried.
Right.
And the coping mechanism isn't, this will be so much better when it's done.
Yeah. You actually, just put it into practice. I mean, it's totally get that. And I really appreciate that last message, because hopefully people will start trying and start doing some of those things that they know is out there. There's a great line I heard years ago from somebody who said, do simple better. Is a lot of the things that we know, or, the strategies, whether it's coping mechanisms, some of that stuff's pretty simple, but you have to just do it,
Yeah. And I think, to me, that's the lesson. It's even if you have, even if you were a great coach and you worked with your athletes on their coping mechanisms and you've done this and you've been developing them, you got to make sure they actually in the moment remembered to do it.
Right. Don't just hope it's over, right?
Don't let your athletes in the moment forget everything you've taught them for a year and just think, but this is almost over.
That's awesome. You just described the experience most of our guests have on this show, by the way. It's just Ashley, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it was very fun. I hope you enjoyed it.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.